Look at your phone for a second. Think about how much has changed in just the last 50 years: smartphones, the internet, space stations. Now, imagine 5,000 years of nothing, no progress, no new inventions, no writing, just silence, and nobody knows why. There is a gap in human history that shouldn't exist. After the last ice age ended, humans had everything they needed. Same brains as us, same bodies, same potential. But for roughly 5,000 years, almost nothing happened. No cities, no writing, no monuments, just small groups of people doing exactly what their ancestors had done for generations. If you are settling in for the night, perfect. This is the kind of mystery that doesn't need to be solved before morning. It has been waiting for 12,000 years. It can wait a few more hours while you drift off. Subscribe and stick around. Here is what we know for certain. Around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended. Massive glaciers that had covered much of the northern hemisphere began to melt. Sea levels rose dramatically, coastlines changed, and suddenly humans found themselves in a world that was warmer, wetter, and filled with new possibilities. The climate became remarkably stable. After tens of thousands of years of wild fluctuations, temperatures settled into a comfortable range. Rainfall became predictable. Seasons became reliable. For the first time in human existence, the world was genuinely hospitable to permanent settlement. And the humans who lived through this transition weren't primitive cave dwellers. They were anatomically modern humans, same brain size as you and me, same cognitive abilities. They could think abstractly. They could plan for the future. They had language, art, music, and complex social structures. We know this because of what they left behind before the gap. Stunning cave paintings that still move us today. Sophisticated tools made from bone and stone. Evidence of long-distance trade networks. Burial sites that show clear spiritual beliefs. These were not simple-minded people. So what happened? Why did these capable, intelligent humans wait 5,000 years before building the first cities, before inventing writing, before creating the foundations of what we call civilization? The honest answer is that nobody really knows, and that mystery has haunted archaeologists for generations. When civilization finally did emerge, it happened almost simultaneously in multiple locations: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China. Within a relatively short span of time, humans went from scattered villages to massive cities with tens of thousands of people. Writing systems appeared, mathematics developed, astronomy became sophisticated. But that raises an uncomfortable question. If humans could build ziggurats and invent writing and create complex governments, why didn't they do it sooner? What were they waiting for? What changed around 5,000 years ago that suddenly made civilization possible? The traditional explanation has always been agriculture. The story goes that once humans learned to farm, they could settle in one place. Surplus food allowed some people to specialize in other tasks. Population grew. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Simple cause and effect. But here is the thing. We now know that agriculture didn't appear suddenly. The transition from hunting and gathering to farming took thousands of years, and during much of that transition, Early farmers were actually worse off than their hunter-gatherer neighbors. Shorter lives, more disease, harder work. Evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey has completely upended our understanding of this timeline. This massive stone monument was built around 11,000 years ago. That is before agriculture was widespread, before pottery, before permanent settlements. Hunter-gatherers built it, and then they buried it on purpose. Think about that for a moment. People who were supposedly too primitive to build cities created a stone monument that required coordinating hundreds of workers, moving multi-ton blocks without wheels, carving intricate animal figures without metal tools. And they did this while still living as nomads. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe show animals that would have been familiar to Ice Age hunters. Lions, bulls, foxes, snakes, scorpions. The craftsmanship is remarkable. These weren't rough scratches. They were deliberate artistic choices made by people who had mastered their medium completely. So, if humans could organize massive construction projects 11,000 years ago, why did it take another 6,000 years for the first true cities to appear? Why is there this gap between capability and implementation? The monument at Göbekli Tepe proves they could do it. But then they stopped. Some researchers believe the answer lies in population density. You need a certain number of people living close together before complex society becomes necessary. Small groups can govern themselves through personal relationships. Everyone knows everyone. But once communities grow past a certain threshold, you need formal structures. The theory suggests that for most of those 5,000 years, human populations simply weren't dense enough. People were spread out across the landscape, even with agriculture slowly developing. Villages remained small hundreds of people, not thousands. And at that scale, you don't need writing, you don't need formal laws, you don't need kings. But here is the problem with that explanation. Population growth during this period was actually quite rapid. Once the Ice Age ended and food became more abundant, human numbers increased dramatically. Some estimates suggest global population grew from perhaps 5 million to over 50 million during this mysterious gap. If population growth was the trigger for civilization, why didn't it happen earlier? By 7,000 years ago, the Middle East had thriving agricultural communities with thousands of residents. They had all the prerequisites: the people, the food surplus, the stable climate. But still no cities, still no writing. Another theory focuses on climate. Yes, the Ice Age ended 12,000 years ago, but the climate didn't stabilize immediately. There were dramatic swings, sudden cold periods that lasted generations, droughts that could wipe out entire regions. Maybe humans were simply waiting for things to calm down. The Younger Dryas is the most famous example. Around 12,900 years ago, just as the world was warming up, temperatures suddenly plunged. In parts of Europe, it got as cold as the worst of the Ice Age. This cold snap lasted over 1,000 years before the warming resumed. Imagine being part of a community that had started to settle down. Maybe you had just begun experimenting with growing plants. Then suddenly the world freezes again. Your crops fail, game animals move south. Everything your grandparents had built collapses. That kind of trauma could set a civilization back generations. But here is the thing. The Younger Dryas ended around 11,700 years ago. After that, the climate was remarkably stable for thousands of years. The conditions were perfect, yet civilization still didn't emerge for another 6,000 years. Climate can't explain the entire gap. Some researchers have proposed more controversial explanations. They point to the sudden appearance of complex societies and wonder if something catalyzed the change. A technological breakthrough we haven't identified. Contact with a more advanced group that left no trace. Knowledge passed down from a civilization that predated the Ice Age. These theories venture into territory that makes mainstream archaeologists uncomfortable. But they raise a valid question. The transition from scattered villages to complex cities happened remarkably fast in archaeological terms. Within just a few centuries, humans went from basic farming communities to building pyramids. That is an extraordinary acceleration. Consider what that acceleration required. Not just physical infrastructure, but entire systems of knowledge. Mathematics sophisticated enough to design monumental architecture. Astronomy detailed enough to align buildings with celestial events. Administrative systems capable of organizing thousands of workers. Where did all of that come from? One intriguing possibility involves the role of memory and knowledge transmission. Hunter-gatherer societies passed information orally from generation to generation, stories, songs, rituals. But oral traditions have limits. Complex technical knowledge is hard to preserve without writing. Each generation has to relearn what the previous one knew. Maybe humans spent those 5,000 years slowly accumulating knowledge. Each generation adding a little bit, making small improvements, developing techniques. But without writing, progress was painfully slow. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, breakthroughs forgotten. Innovations lost when the person who knew them died. Then something changed. Maybe a critical mass of interconnected communities finally made knowledge preservation possible. Maybe trade networks became dense enough that innovations could spread faster than they were forgotten. The written word emerged not as an invention, but as a necessity. The earliest writing wasn't poetry or philosophy. It was accounting. Lists of goods, records of transactions, debts owed and paid. Writing emerged because societies had become too complex to manage through memory alone. You needed permanent records. You needed symbols that meant the same thing to everyone. But that still doesn't fully explain the gap. Humans had been trading for tens of thousands of years. Why did record keeping suddenly become necessary around 5,000 years ago? What changed about the nature of trade or the size of economies that required this innovation? Some archaeologists point to metallurgy as the key factor. Copper working appeared around 7,000 years ago. Bronze followed a few thousand years later. Metal tools were more durable than stone. Metal weapons were more deadly. And most importantly, metal could be melted down and reshaped. It was the first truly recyclable resource. Metal changed the economics of everything. Suddenly, wealth could be accumulated in a portable, durable form. A family could save copper ingots the way we save money. Trade became more sophisticated because metal provided a universal medium of exchange, and whoever controlled the metal sources controlled power. But here is the thing. Copper working was known for 2,000 years before the first cities appeared. People had figured out how to extract metal from ore and shape it into tools. They just didn't use that knowledge to build civilizations. The technology existed. The application was delayed. Perhaps the answer lies in social organization rather than technology. Anthropologists have identified a phenomenon called the agricultural trap. Once you commit to farming, you are stuck. You can't easily go back to hunting and gathering. Your population grows to match your food production. Moving becomes impossible. Early farmers might have resisted this trap for generations. They watched their hunter-gatherer neighbors with envy. The foragers had more varied diets, more leisure time, less back-breaking labor. Why give that up for the uncertainty of depending on a few domesticated crops? The historical record suggests that many early farming experiments failed. Communities would try agriculture, have a bad harvest, and return to foraging. The commitment to full-time farming happened slowly, reluctantly, and often only when there was no other choice. When the wild foods ran out, when populations had grown too large to feed any other way. This creates a compelling explanation for at least part of the gap. Humans weren't waiting for technology or knowledge. They were avoiding a way of life they knew was harder. Civilization wasn't a gift to be eagerly embraced. It was a trap that humans fell into reluctantly. But if that is true, what finally tipped the balance? What forced humans to commit to the agricultural way of life that made cities and writing necessary? Some researchers point to environmental pressure. As populations grew, wild resources became scarce. Hunting and gathering could no longer support everyone. Others suggest social competition played a role. Once some groups committed to agriculture and built permanent settlements, they could support larger populations. Those larger populations could field bigger armies. The farmers could simply overwhelm the foragers through sheer numbers. There is also the religion hypothesis. Sites like Göbekli Tepe suggest that spiritual beliefs played a major role in bringing people together. Maybe civilization didn't emerge from practical necessity at all. Maybe it emerged from the human need to honor something greater than ourselves. Think about what it would take to build a monument like Göbekli Tepe. Hundreds of people working together for years. They needed to be fed. They needed to be organized. They needed a shared purpose that justified all that effort. Religion provides exactly that kind of motivation. Perhaps the earlier cities weren't administrative centers or trade hubs at all. Perhaps they were pilgrimage sites, places where scattered communities came together for rituals and ceremonies. Over time, some people stayed year-round to maintain the sacred sites. Support communities grew around them, and eventually cities emerged. But here is the thing. If religion was the catalyst for civilization, why did it take 5,000 years after Göbekli Tepe for true cities to appear? The people who built that monument clearly had sophisticated spiritual beliefs. They had the organizational capacity, yet they walked away from it. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe is one of the great mysteries of archaeology. Someone decided to fill in this massive monument with earth and rubble, to hide it, to end whatever it represented. Why would you bury something you had worked so hard to build? Some researchers speculate that the site was buried because the world it represented was ending. The old ways of the hunter-gatherers were giving way to something new. The animal spirits carved on those pillars no longer held power in a world of farms and villages. Burying the temple was a way of closing a chapter, but that raises another question. If the transition to agricultural society was already happening 11,000 years ago, why is there such a long gap before we see the full flowering of civilization? The people at Göbekli Tepe were already on the path. What delayed them for another 5,000 years? One possibility is that we're asking the wrong question. Maybe the gap isn't a gap at all. Maybe plenty was happening during those 5,000 years. But it left no trace. Buildings made of wood and mud, societies organized around perishable goods. Knowledge preserved in songs and stories rather than clay tablets. Archaeology has a preservation bias. We find what survives. Stone monuments endure. Mud brick crumbles. Metal artifacts persist. Wooden tools rot. It is entirely possible that sophisticated societies existed during this period, but used materials that simply didn't last. We see a gap because we can only see what remains. Recent discoveries have started to fill in some of these blanks. Sites in Turkey, Syria, and Iran have revealed complex communities from the mysterious period. Not true cities, but substantial settlements with specialized craft production, evidence of long-distance trade, social hierarchies. These weren't simple villages. At Faytal-Fayke in Turkey, archaeologists found a settlement that housed perhaps 8,000 people around 9,000 years ago. That is larger than many medieval European towns. The inhabitants lived in tightly packed houses entered through the roof. They buried their dead beneath their floors. They painted murals on their walls. But Faytal-Fayke wasn't a city in the way we usually understand the term. There was no central government, no obvious temples, no palace, no clear social hierarchy visible in the architecture. People lived remarkably equal lives, large-scale cooperation without apparent leadership. This challenges our assumptions about how civilization develops. We assume that complexity requires hierarchy, that large populations need strong leaders, that inequality is the price of progress. But Faytal-Fayke suggests that for over 1,000 years, humans found another way. Maybe the real mystery isn't why civilization took so long to develop. Maybe it is why humans eventually gave up on more egalitarian forms of organization. Why did we accept kings and taxes and rigid hierarchies? What pressures forced us to abandon the Faytal-Fayke model? Some researchers point to warfare. As long as communities were small and resources were abundant, conflict was limited. But as populations grew and good land became scarce, competition intensified. Groups with strong military leaders had advantages over egalitarian communities. War selected for hierarchy, others emphasized the role of irrigation. In the river valleys where the first true cities emerged, agriculture required massive water management projects. Canals had to be dug and maintained. Water had to be distributed fairly. That kind of coordination seemed to require centralized authority. The great river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus were uniquely suited to this kind of development. Predictable annual floods deposited rich soil. The rivers provided transportation networks. and the dry surrounding landscape meant that whoever controlled the water controlled everything. But here is the thing. Humans had lived along these rivers for thousands of years without developing state-level societies. The geographic advantages were always there. The environmental conditions hadn't changed. Something else must have tipped the balance. Something happened around 5,000 years ago that we still don't fully understand. Some of the most intriguing recent research focuses on social networks. Modern studies show that innovation spreads through connections between communities. The more interconnected people are, the faster new ideas move. Isolation leads to stagnation. Connection leads to acceleration. Perhaps the key change around 5,000 years ago was the density of these connections. Trade networks that had been sparse became dense. Communities that had been isolated became integrated. And once you cross a certain threshold of connectivity, innovation becomes self-sustaining progress, accelerates because progress builds on progress. This could explain why civilization emerged almost simultaneously in multiple locations. It wasn't that the Sumerians invented something that spread to Egypt and the Indus. It was that a global network of exchange had finally become dense enough to support rapid innovation everywhere at once. But we still don't know what caused that network to suddenly become denser. Was it population growth reaching a critical threshold? New transportation technologies like sailing ships and wheeled vehicles? Climate shifts that opened new migration routes? All of these probably played a role, but the exact trigger remains unclear. If you are still with me at this point, consider what this mystery means for our understanding of human potential. For 5,000 years, people with the same brains as us lived without civilization as we know it, not because they couldn't build it, but because something held them back. Were they missing some piece of knowledge? Were they blocked by environmental conditions? Were they choosing to live differently? Or is our entire framework for understanding this transition fundamentally flawed? Maybe the question isn't what caused civilization to emerge. Maybe it is why we assume it should have emerged sooner. We tend to see history as progress. Stone tools to bronze, villages to cities, oral traditions to writing. Each step up a ladder toward our current world. But what if that is not how the people living through it experienced it? What if civilization wasn't progress at all, but adaptation to increasingly difficult circumstances? Hunter-gatherers, who still exist today, often pity agricultural societies. They see the long hours of labor, the rigid hierarchies, the diseases that come from living in crowded conditions. From their perspective, we're not more advanced. We're trapped in a way of life that our ancestors were wise enough to avoid. Maybe the 5,000-year gap represents the last stand of a more balanced way of living. Humans resisting the changes they could see coming, holding on to traditions that worked, only gradually, reluctantly succumbing to pressures they couldn't control. That is a more melancholy interpretation than the standard story of human triumph. But it might be closer to the truth. Progress isn't always chosen. Sometimes it is forced. And the people who lived through these transitions might have mourned what they were losing even as they built what we now celebrate. What we can say for certain is that the emergence of civilization was not inevitable. The archaeological record shows false starts and abandoned experiments, societies that developed complex features and then simplified communities that built monuments and then buried them. The path from hunter-gatherer to city-dweller was neither straight nor smooth, and that uncertainty continues today. Modern civilization is only about 5,000 years old, a blink of an eye in human history. The hunter-gatherer way of life that preceded it lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. If you had to bet on which approach was more sustainable, the evidence isn't entirely on civilization's side. But perhaps that is what makes this mystery so compelling. The 5,000-year gap isn't just an archaeological puzzle. It is a window into fundamental questions about human nature. Are we builders by instinct, delayed only by circumstance? Or is the drive to build cities and empires something that had to be forced upon us? The honest answer is that we don't know. Despite decades of research and remarkable archaeological discoveries, the transition to civilization remains one of history's great mysteries. We have pieces of the puzzle, we have theories, but no single explanation accounts for everything we've found, and maybe that is how it should be. Some mysteries deserve to stay mysterious, not because we've given up trying to solve them, but because the process of wondering is itself valuable. Every new discovery changes our understanding. Every assumption overturned opens new possibilities. Think about what we've learned in just the last few decades. Göbekli Tepe completely rewrote our understanding of prehistoric capabilities. Genetic studies revealed migrations and mixtures we never suspected. Climate reconstructions showed a far more turbulent past than we imagined. The story keeps changing because we keep finding new evidence. The next major discovery could come from anywhere. A construction project in Turkey, a drought that reveals submerged sites, new techniques for analyzing ancient DNA somewhere out there buried in the earth is evidence that could finally explain those mysterious 5,000 years. Or maybe we'll discover that there was no single explanation, that different factors mattered in different places, that civilization emerged through 1,000 small changes rather than one dramatic transformation. History is rarely as simple as we want it to be. What we can appreciate is the strangeness of our situation. You and I exist at the end of a 5,000-year experiment in a particular way of organizing human life, cities, nations, writing, technology. All of this is remarkably new in human terms, and there is no guarantee it will last. The people who lived during that mysterious gap were not less human than us. They loved and feared and wondered, just as we do. They looked up at the same stars. They told stories around fires. They buried their dead with care and ceremony. Their inner lives were as rich as ours. They just chose to organize themselves differently, or circumstances forced them down different paths. Either way, they remind us that the way we live now is not the only way humans have lived, not the only way we could live. Just one option among many that our species has tried. If you've made it this far, you are probably thinking about what comes next. After our current civilization, will future archaeologists puzzle over our ruins the way we puzzle over theirs? Will they wonder why we built so much and then stopped? Will our era become another mysterious gap in some future timeline? Those are questions we can't answer, but they connect us to the people who came before. Every generation lives through changes they don't fully understand. Every era feels like the pivot point of history. The 5,000-year gap felt normal to the people who lived through it, just as our world feels normal to us. So if you are drifting off now, let that thought carry you into sleep. Somewhere in your body are genes that passed through those mysterious millennia. Your ancestors navigated whatever challenges that era presented. They survived, which is why you exist. Their story is your story. Even if we don't know all the details, the mystery of the missing 5,000 years will still be here tomorrow. Archaeologists will keep digging. Researchers will keep theorizing. New evidence will keep emerging. And maybe someday we'll understand what our ancestors were doing during all that time, what they were waiting for, what finally changed. But for tonight, let the mystery be a comfort rather than a frustration. The fact that we don't know everything means there is still more to discover, still more to wonder about, still more chapters to be written in the long story of humanity. Thanks for spending this time exploring one of history's strangest puzzles, the gap that shouldn't exist, the silence we can't explain, the 5,000 years that somehow produced everything that followed. Subscribe and stick around for more journeys through the unknown. Sleep well, and when you wake up, remember that you are part of an experiment in human organization that is still unfolding. We're all living through history, whether we realize it or not. The story isn't finished. It might never be finished. And that is perhaps the most fascinating thing of all, and perhaps the most humbling realization is this. For all our technology and knowledge, we still can't fully explain how we got here. The civilizations we take for granted rest on foundations we don't completely understand. That mysterious 5,000-year period isn't just ancient history. It is the dark room we walked through to reach the light. There is a theory that deserves more attention than it usually gets. It focuses on something we rarely think about. Language, not just spoken language, which humans had for tens of thousands of years, but a particular kind of language, the ability to talk about things that don't exist, to coordinate around shared fictions. Think about what holds a modern nation together. Laws, money, borders, corporations. None of these exist in any physical sense. They're all agreed upon fictions, shared stories that we treat as real because everyone else treats them as real. The ability to create and believe in such fictions is uniquely human. Some researchers believe that this capacity for shared fiction developed slowly over those mysterious millennia. Not the basic ability to imagine, which is ancient, but the specific ability to get thousands of strangers to believe in the same invisible institutions, to trust a king you've never met, to accept currency from people you'll never see again. Hunter-gatherer bands are held together by personal relationships. Everyone knows everyone. Trust is based on direct experience. You cooperate with your cousin because you've known your cousin your whole life. But cities require trust between strangers. That is a fundamentally different cognitive and social challenge. Maybe the 5,000-year gap represents the time it took to develop these new forms of trust, to create religious institutions that bound strangers together, to establish legal codes that governed relationships between people who would never meet face to face, to invent the very concept of abstract authority. This would explain why civilization emerged almost simultaneously in multiple places. It wasn't that one group invented something and spread it to others. It was that human cognitive and social evolution had finally reached a threshold where these institutions became possible, like water suddenly boiling when it reaches the right temperature. But here is the thing. If that is true, what exactly changed in human minds or human societies to cross that threshold? Our brains didn't suddenly get bigger. There is no evidence of genetic changes. The shift had to be cultural. Learned behavior passed from generation to generation. But what specifically was learned? One possibility involves hierarchical thinking. The ability to mentally organize complex systems with multiple levels. A village has a chief. A group of villages has a paramount chief. A region has a king. The king has a god above him. Each level contains and controls the levels below. This kind of nested hierarchy isn't natural to the human mind. Young children don't naturally think in hierarchies. They have to learn it. And maintaining complex hierarchical structures requires constant reinforcement. Rituals that remind people of their place. Architecture that embodies the levels. Stories that explain why the hierarchy is natural and good. Perhaps those 5,000 years were spent developing these cognitive tools, teaching each generation to think in ways that made complex societies possible, building the mental infrastructure that would eventually support cities and empires and nations. There is also the question of specialization. In a hunter-gatherer band, everyone is a generalist. Everyone can make their own tools, find their own food, build their own shelter. There might be some division of labor between men and women, but basically any adult can do what any other adult can do. Cities require the opposite. Extreme specialization. Potters who only make pots, scribes who only write, soldiers who only fight, priests who only pray. Each person depends on dozens of others for basic survival. That kind of interdependence is deeply unnatural and deeply risky. If the potter gets sick, who makes the pots? If the harvest fails, the scribes can't eat their clay tablets. Specialized societies are more productive than generalist ones, but they're also more fragile. One broken link can bring down the whole chain. Humans may have resisted specialization for thousands of years precisely because they understood this risk. Better to be self-sufficient than dependent on strangers. Better to know a little about everything than everything about one thing. Specialization was a gamble that our ancestors were slow to take. What finally forced the gamble? Probably population pressure. When there are too many people for everyone to be a generalist, when resources become scarce enough that maximum efficiency is necessary for survival, then specialization becomes not a choice but a requirement. But that still doesn't explain the timing. Why did population pressure become acute around 5,000 years ago and not earlier? Human numbers had been growing for millennia. What made that particular moment the tipping point? Some researchers point to what is called the urban revolution theory. The idea is that cities weren't just a larger version of villages. They were something qualitatively different. A new form of human organization that required new ways of thinking and new institutions that had to be invented from scratch. A village of a few hundred people can govern itself through tradition and consensus. An elder remembers how things were done in the past. Disputes are settled through negotiation. Everyone knows their role, but a city of 10,000 people needs written laws, professional administrators, formal institutions. Creating those institutions isn't easy. It requires experimentation, trial and error. Many failures for every success. Maybe the 5,000-year gap represents all the failed experiments we don't see. All the societies that tried to scale up and collapsed. All the early cities that grew and then shattered. We only see the successes. The Mesopotamian and Egyptian and Indus societies that figured out how to make cities work. But behind them, invisible in the archaeological record, might be hundreds of attempts that didn't survive. Each failure teaching lessons that eventually led to success. This changes how we should think about the gap. It wasn't wasted time. It was research and development. Humanity trying to solve one of the hardest problems in social engineering. How do you get thousands of strangers to live together peacefully and productively? 5,000 years to solve that problem doesn't seem so long, when you put it that way. And in truth, we haven't really solved it even now. Modern cities still struggle with crime and conflict and inequality. Nations go to war. Societies collapse. The problems that confronted those ancient community builders are the same problems we face today, just at a larger scale. Maybe that is the real lesson of the 5,000-year gap. Human social organization is genuinely difficult. It requires constant effort and constant innovation. There is no final answer, no permanent solution. Every generation has to figure out how to live together again. The people who lived through that mysterious period weren't failures. They were experimenters, trying different approaches, learning what worked and what didn't, building the knowledge base that their descendants would eventually use to create the first cities. We are the beneficiaries of their efforts. Every institution we take for granted, from money to marriage to government, was invented by someone, often by someone whose name we'll never know. Someone who lived during those 5,000 years of supposed nothing. Someone whose innovation finally stuck. So when you drift off tonight, maybe offer a silent thanks to those anonymous inventors. The first person who figured out how to mediate disputes between strangers. The first person who established a currency that people actually trusted. The first person who convinced a community to accept a leader they'd never met. Their names are lost. Their individual struggles are invisible. But their solutions survived, passed from community to community, generation to generation, until eventually they became the foundations of the world we live in today. The missing 5,000 years weren't really missing at all. They were full of drama and innovation and failure and success. We just can't see most of it because it was written in wood instead of stone, spoken instead of inscribed, lived instead of recorded. But those people were as real as we are. They had hopes and fears and dreams. They raised children and buried parents. They looked up at the same sky and wondered what it all meant. The gap in our knowledge isn't a gap in their existence. And that might be the most important thing to remember. History isn't just what got written down. It is everything that ever happened. The stories we know are just a tiny fraction of all the stories that were lived. For every hero remembered, 1,000,000 ordinary people were forgotten. The 5,000-year gap reminds us of that truth. It humbles us. It shows us how much we don't know and can never know. But it also connects us to everyone who came before. We're all part of the same long story, whether our chapter gets written down or not. So rest now. Let the mystery be a comfort. The questions will still be here tomorrow, and the day after that, and for generations to come. Every year we learn a little more. Every discovery fills in another piece. Slowly, patiently, we're reconstructing the past. But some mysteries may never be solved. And that is okay too. A world without mystery would be a poorer world. The unknown is what drives us forward. What makes us dig and search and wonder. The 5,000-year gap keeps us curious. Thanks again for joining me on this journey through time. Through the silence of those mysterious millennia. Through the theories and speculations and honest admissions of ignorance. It has been quite a trip. Subscribe and stick around for more explorations of the unknown. More questions that don't have easy answers. More journeys into the darkness where knowledge runs out and wonder begins. Sleep well tonight, and dream of those ancient ancestors. The ones who lived through the gap. The ones whose names we'll never know. They're part of you. And you are part of the story they started telling so long ago. The missing 5,000 years. Not really missing at all, just waiting to be remembered. Just waiting for us to figure out how to see what was always there. Good night. But before you drift off completely, there is one more thing worth considering. The mystery of the 5,000-year gap has a mirror image in our own time. We're living through a transition just as profound as the one that ended it, and we can't see where it is going any more than those ancient people could see where their world was heading. In the past century, human life has changed more dramatically than in any comparable period of history. We've gone from horse-drawn carriages to space stations, from handwritten letters to instant global communication, from populations of millions to populations of billions. The pace of change is accelerating in ways that would be incomprehensible to anyone living even a few generations ago. Are we in the middle of another gap? Another period of fundamental reorganization that future historians will puzzle over? Will they look back at our era and wonder why it took us so long to figure out whatever comes next? Will they see patterns and turning points that are invisible to us because we're too close? These questions have no answers tonight. They're too big and too uncertain and too dependent on events that haven't happened yet. But they connect us to those ancient people in a way that nothing else can. We're all just trying to navigate transitions we don't fully understand. The 5,000-year gap teaches us that transitions take time, that progress isn't linear, that societies can hover on the edge of transformation for generations before finally tipping over into something new. Maybe that is exactly where we are now. On the edge, waiting for whatever comes next, but that is a worry for daylight hours. For now, let the ancient mystery carry you into dreams. Let the questions wait. Let your mind wander through those 5,000 years like a traveler walking through a misty landscape where everything is half seen and half imagined. Tomorrow the world will still be changing. The research will continue. The discoveries will accumulate piece by piece. We'll keep building our understanding of where we came from and who we are. But tonight, the mystery is enough. The wonder is enough. The not knowing is enough. 5,000 years of human experience. Millions of lives lived. Countless struggles and triumphs and ordinary days. All of it leading to this moment. To you listening in the dark, wondering about people whose names are lost forever, but whose legacy lives in every institution and technology and idea that shapes our world. That is a lot to carry, but you don't have to carry it tonight. Just let it rest. Let it settle. Let the 5,000 years fold themselves into your sleep, like a blanket woven from questions and maybes and what-ifs. The missing years aren't really missing. They're just quiet, waiting for us to learn how to listen, waiting for the right questions to be asked, waiting for technology and insight, and luck to combine in just the right way to reveal what was hidden. Until then, the mystery remains. A reminder of how much we don't know. A challenge to future generations. A gift, really, because a solved mystery is a closed book. An unsolved mystery is an invitation. Good night, and welcome to the long conversation between past and present, known and unknown. Question and answer. You are part of it now. You always were. Sleep well.